Hey VCers far and wide, it's Matt again, and I'm back to do another video. Still have some time off work this week. Joe, Mr. Mayo, the other night on one of his live streams on YouTube mentioned the fact that a lot of people consider the Beatles to be great, and then when they broke up, the solo Beatles were never any good, or as good at least. And his argument was that they made a lot of great albums as their solo years, which I tend to agree with. I don't think with I don't think that they ever matched anything the Beatles did solo, but I think they came close a few times, and I think other times they made some albums that were great in their own way, different way, and own right. So maybe I don't know so much on this album or not, but started my solo Beatle album reviews yesterday with The Family Way by Paul McCartney, which is an album most people don't really consider a proper part of the solo Beatles catalog, and probably rightly so because he didn't have a whole lot to do with that. But we move on today with an album that is what's generally considered the start of McCartney's solo career, which is an album called McCartney. And this is my original copy that I bought back when I was about 12 or 13, back in 77 or so. You've all seen the cover. That's the front cover, actually. The bowl of cherries there, which I was never crazy about. I always kind of considered this the cover, even though it's the back cover, or I liked it more. But yeah, and this one is on not the Apple label, but the Capitol label, because like I said, I bought it around 77. Having been a huge Beatle fan since the time of 1973 when I was like 9 or 10. I was, of course, when you're a kid, you don't have a lot of money, so I spent what little money I could get and birthdays and stuff trying to collect the Beatles albums, which back then were the American albums. I didn't know till a little bit later that they were different in England. And so I didn't really get into the solo albums, even though I was aware, even back then, that the band had broken up. And, you heard some stuff on the radio, My Sweet Lord, and Band on the Run, and so forth. But I didn't really get into the solo albums, uh, part because of money and being a kid and not being able to just go out and buy everything, till probably 76, 77 or so. So I bought this several years after it came out. This album came out in April of 1970, which is kind of strange when you think about it now, thinking about the time back then, because Let It Be came out in May of 1970, so this actually came out before Let It Be, so the Beatles were still a thing when this came out. I think Let It Be came out about a month after the band officially broke up. By this time, Ringo had already had his first solo album, Sentimental Journey, which came out in March of 70. And of course, John and George had already released solo albums going back to 1968 and 9, even though those were those kind of weird experimental albums more than that. So this came out at a time when the Beatles were still in existence. There was a huge or at least there was an argument between the three Beatles over management. They wanted Alan Klein. Paul wanted, I think, Lee Eastman, who was Linda's dad or uncle or somebody to represent the Beatles. They argued that Let It Be was, they wanted Let It Be to come out before this because there was a movie was coming out and they wanted the album at the same time. And apparently they sent Ringo around to ask him if he would delay this a month or two just so the two albums didn't jibe. And according to Ringo, Paul went crazy and threw a fit and threw him out of his house. And eventually they compromised, and this came out a month or so before Let It Be. So there's some of the background to that. Also, Paul was the one who had right around, not too long before this, had announced the breakup of the Beatles. John had announced it to the band before that, but Paul and I think Alan Klein even sort of convinced him to keep a lid on that for the time being and not announce it publicly. And then Paul announced it publicly. So a lot of fans were not happy with Paul for quote unquote breaking up the Beatles at the time this came out. The Beatles, of course, were not getting along all that well, naturally, the four members there at this time. And so that kind of played into why this album was not widely appreciated at the time. But it did okay. I mean, it got to number one in the United States, got to number two in England. So sales-wise, it did fine. Um, there was, but the reviews at the time were by and large not good. Uh, in Melody Maker, Richard Williams, in his review, wrote he broke up the Beatles for this. Um, but then, and I never can pronounce this guy's name, Robert Christo, who used to, I don't know if he's still around or not, but he used to be in Cream magazine, and he used to be in some other music newspapers and magazines forever, doing these little like one paragraph reviews of albums. And his review at the time in 1970 when this came out was, when I first heard this, I felt insulted. He said he thought it was Paul trying to put his ego on the shelf like John had with the Two Virgins, Life with the Lions, those type albums. But then he argued that Paul's knack for melody is not going to let him do something like that. But then he goes back and says it's a very lightweight album, and the instrumental tracks are draggy and awkward. And Paul plays all the instruments on this album, by the way. Christo says maybe on the next album Linda should learn to play the drums because she couldn't, not like she could do any worse. So, ouch there. Um, New Musical Express in England said harmlessly mild, but gave it a overall okay review. Said excitement's not the word for this album. Warmth and happiness are. But then also said there's no substance on the album, so it's kind of a schizophrenic review. Um, and Rolling Stone at the time said the greatest disappointment in the songs is that most could have been saved by better performances. Called the album distinctly second rate, so modest it barely registers. But then the reviewer says, I like this album very much, so go figure. Um, that critical response has changed in the years since some. The All Music Review said it's charming in retrospect, and endearing, ragged, homemade quality to it. So, and I remember the Beatle books and stuff at the time back in the 70s didn't really hold this in high regard. Um, Ron Schomburg basically liked the album, but said it was nothing great. Nicholas Schaffner called it basically insubstantial, and so forth and so on. And The Beatles Forever, these are two of the books, that great Beatle books from back in the 70s. Schomburg, oddly enough, says that his biggest objection to the album is the pictures in the gatefold, which make the butcher cover seem tasteful. And I never understood that. I remember reading that at the time and not understanding it, because there's really nothing in there that's, and you got Paul picking his nose, and you got Martha licking her nose, but you got that baby being held up and interrogated maybe, but I don't really see anything terribly gross or distasteful there. But anyway, yeah, so, so their fans were, like I said, some of them were mad at Paul because they thought he's the one who broke up the Beatles at that time. And I think you gotta Let It Be wasn't even out yet. The Beatles were still a thing. People went out and bought this at the time, were probably expecting Abbey Road or Sgt. Pepper or something on that par, which it definitely isn't. So they were probably let down by that fact. I'm thinking maybe, I was 6 when the Beatles broke up, so not like I was paying a lot of attention, but I'm thinking a lot of people probably thought John having done all the weird stuff with Yoko, with Two Virgins and Wedding Album, and George's Electronic Sounds, and now this. Maybe the Beatles were just needed a break from each other to get this stuff out of their system, and people maybe at the time thought that a year or so from now they'll work that out and get back together and get back to making Beatles albums. I don't know that that's the case, but I'm thinking maybe that might have been. You also got to look at the fact that this is kind of a lo-fi. He made a lot of this at his home, recorded a lot of this at his home. Some of the stuff he recorded at EMI or Abbey Road and at some of the other studios professionally, but a lot of this he had worked on over the last part of '69 and the early part of '70, and and so there's a kind of a homemade quality and a lo-fi quality which would be in vogue 10, 20 years later, but in 1970 was definitely not in vogue. So you got to look at what was happening in music at the time, with Sgt. Pepper having led to rock as an important uh, artistic music now, as opposed to just teenage junk, and that sort of just carried on into '68, '69, and '70. I looked up some of the big albums of the year, and just to refresh my memory, but I mean, you had huge albums by Led Zeppelin that year, Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water, Neil Young, Everyone Knows This Is Nowhere, Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere, Fun House by the Stooges, Bitches Brew by Miles Davis, sort of taking jazz and rock into jazz fusion, Layla, Derek and the Dominoes, Velvet Underground's last album, a couple of Grateful Dead albums, Who Live at Leeds, Adam Hart Mother, Pink Floyd, Morrison Hotel by the Doors. I mean, it's hard to believe that the Doors, Jim Morrison was still alive when this came out, and the Doors were still a thing, and they still had an album after Morrison Hotel to go. So, at that time, rock was not the fun kid stuff that it had been just a few years before in people's minds. At that time, it was a serious art form, and you were supposed to be making these profound statements, and no one had made more profound statements than the Beatles with things like Rubber Soul, Revolver, Pepper, White Album, etc., etc. So to get this sort of lightweight throwaway album threw everyone for a curve, and thus probably many of the bad reviews when it came out. And the other thing that I thought of was this came out in 1970, and so there was probably, I know every time a new decade starts, I remember going from the '70s to the '80s and being excited about sort of a fresh start and what are the '80s going to be, and they'll be different than the '70s. So there's sort of that expectation of, a new a new decade, a new start. And okay, we had the '60s, we had the Beatles, but now it's something new. So who's going to be time to move on to something new attitude that a lot of people probably had, because the Beatles were always going to be remembered forever, but they were not in 1970 probably yet that Mount Rushmore that they are now in a lot of ways. In fact, I remember being into the Beatles because I was in grade school and middle school in the '70s, and I loved the Beatles, and I got ragged on from time to time from other kids that would say, well, they were great way back when, which is kind of funny because way back when was like 5 or 6 years previous. But why don't you get into the new groups now that are new and better, like Kiss and Foreigner and Boston and Peter Frampton, which anyway. So I mean, there was probably at this point in time, I know Joe's been asked on his live streams by people, who's going to be the next Beatles, and he says there's not going to be an next Beatles, which you never know, but I pretty much tend to agree with that. But I mean, at this time in 1970, that probably wasn't the thought pattern yet, and kids were thinking, our parents had Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra, our older brothers and sisters had Elvis Presley, and then we had the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and whatever, and now it's a new decade, and there was no reason at that time to believe that there wasn't going to be another band or person that was going to be, the next big thing and the next Beatles per se, and whether that was going to be Led Zeppelin or Chicago or Elton John or James Taylor or who knew what. But I don't think people in 1970 when this came out were probably sitting there thinking, well, we've had the Beatles and that's as good as it's going to get, and there might be other good bands, but there's never going to be a band as big as the Beatles again. That type of thinking didn't come in till later, I don't think. So, yeah. The how I came to the album, like I said, I knew about the Beatles basically all my life because of my older brothers and their friends that were the age to be listening to them, so I was aware of them. I didn't really get into them till '73, and it started wanting to buy albums and stuff, or begging or bugging my parents to buy albums for me, which they did here and there. And so, like I said, at first I was just working on buying the Beatles albums because there were plenty of them, because all those American albums, Something New, Beatles' second album, early Beatles, Yesterday and Today, and so forth and so on. And I didn't have, I was aware that they'd broken up. I'd heard some of the songs. I didn't really have anything solo Beatle-wise, with one exception. We'll get to that in a couple of reviews down the road. And I had a handful of 45s. I think I had Live and Let Die, Mind Games, and two of the Ringo, You're 16, and Photograph. Nothing by George, oddly enough. But in summer of '77, I believe it was, I made a small fortune mowing lawns. And I was, like I said, 12 or 13. And I made like 70, 80 bucks. And I took the bulk of it and went to Sound Warehouse and bought a bunch of records, much to my dad's chagrin and disgust that I didn't set some of that money aside, which maybe I probably should have. But, of course, records cost a lot less back then, and I bought the Beatles' second album was the only one of the Beatles. This was a double album, so I already had gotten the White Album for Christmas or something a few years before that. So I got that, and then I thought, well, maybe it's time to buy some solo Beatle albums. So I bought this, I bought Ram, Shaved Fish, All Things Must Pass, and Concert for Bangladesh, and the Beatles Story. So these were, with that one exception we'll get to down the road, really my first group of solo Beatles albums. So I went home and listened to these, and I always had an up and down relationship with this album because I didn't really like it all that much back then. And the only thing I was familiar with beforehand were I had heard Maybe I'm Amazed on the radio, of course, and I know that came out as a 45 of the live version from Wings at the Speed of Sound in '76 or '77, but I remember there was never a 45 off this album. I remember hearing that on the radio before '76, so I was familiar with that, and every night used to be played on the radio a lot in Fort Worth, Dallas area back in the '70s. And it's kind of weird because after '79 or so, I don't remember ever hearing it on the radio after that, but it got a lot of airplay back then, and I've never even heard Every Night on the Beatles XM channel yet that I remember. So, but I was unaware of the rest of this album, unfamiliar with the rest of this album. I listened to this, and I listened. Oh, and the other George Harrison, Living in the Material World. I got in that group of albums too. So I played all those albums, and this one was probably the one I liked the least out of that group. And it wasn't a terrible album. It just was sort of sounded like half-baked fragments of songs and just meandering around and didn't really go anywhere. And I played it quite a bit just to try to get a feel for it, and just never warmed up to it, and pretty much put it on the shelf, and didn't listen to it for years. And then I pulled it out a few years ago, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, and realized I hadn't played it in decades, and gave it a play and found that I like it more now than I did back then. It's not his greatest album by any means, but I like it quite a bit more. It's being that it's an album of just sort of half-baked songs and fragments. It works for me if it's, instead of picking individual songs off the album, if you just play the whole thing through front and back. Um, and while it's nothing great, I like it pretty well, and he did a lot better solo. And there's one song on here that I don't like, and it's going to make everybody get the pitchforks out and come after me, but there it is. So let's see. Let's start going through the songs. First song is called "The Lovely Linda," which is all of I think it's like 43 seconds long. Just a little introduction into the album. I think it works well as an introduction. It's a nice little snippet, that love song to his Linda, who he just married here the year before in '69. Uh, it's I mean, it's something that probably he should have just sang to her and left off the album, maybe, because it's not that great of a song, but it's nice, and it's over before you know it, and it kind of makes a good intro into the album. But it's I mean, I give it a 5. I don't really like it or dislike it. Second song, That Would Be Something. This one I like quite a bit, and I liked quite a bit back then. This is the lyrically, Meet You in the Falling Rain. It's kind of a nice image of walking through the rain and running into a really cute girl that says hi to you, I guess. Sounds like he's having a lot of fun laying down this song. Just sort of, I guess he could have taken it in the studio and polished it into something a little more finished product, but it sounds like he's just sort of sitting around in his den with his electric guitar and kind of forming up a song and playing and singing it and making it up as he goes along, and hadn't quite finished it yet. But it's charming in that way, and it works, and I give that one an 8. Third song on side one is called Valentine's Day, or is it Valentine? Yeah, Valentine Day. It's an instrumental. I like the guitar bit on it, but it sounds like it's just Paul sitting around in his living room and messing around with his guitar and having fun, as opposed to this is seriously a track for an album, just sort of warming up or playing around, goofing around, having fun. It's not a whole lot to it, but it's a fun song. I give it a 6. The next song is excuse me. Next song is Every Night, which I said I remembered hearing on the radio back in the '70s a lot. Great vocal. Uh, it's good lyrics too, because I mean, one thing as Paul McCartney's solo career goes on, and pretty quick, he gets charged with having these inane or silly or nonsensical or pointless juvenile lyrics, which is certainly can't argue with that. But here's a song where he's actually singing about something, just being stuck out on the farm alone, and sort of separated from the other Beatles because of everything, all the stress and arguments that are going on. And when he's making this album, before and after, he was pretty depressed with the John Lennon had told him there that he wanted to end the Beatles a couple of months or whatever beforehand, and pretty lost and not sure what to do at that point in his life. And so this is a upbeat sounding song, but it's sort of, I always thought of as Paul being honest and singing about himself instead of projecting his emotions on a third person type thing, like For No One or Eleanor Rigby or Another Day or something. And I always thought of that one song as kind of his Plastic Ono Band album moment on this album. And yeah, so I like that. I give that song a 9, and that might well be my favorite song on the album. So yeah, song number 5 is Hot as Sun and Glasses, which has a sort of a Spanish music and sort of a Caribbean island type groove of music. Pleasant little instrumental that's a nice little bit of filler. Not much to it though. It's not great. I give it a 3. I don't hate it, but it's nothing I'm going to go out of my way to listen to. Sixth song on this there is got a lot of songs on here. Sixth song on side 1 is Junk, which was a song that he wrote in India when the Beatles were there in '68. Was considered for the White Album, but didn't make the cut. So sort of gives me a feel of a lazy middle of the day in summer, kicking back type ditty. Okay vocals on it. Sounds like a work in progress that he didn't take the time to finish and just rushed out the just sort of put out the rough demo of it. And I mean, I also see this album he should have. I do agree with the arguments that he should have taken more time and worked on these songs a little more, and might have been a much better album had he done it. But I see the point that he's thinking the Beatles are breaking up, or he had just said the Beatles are breaking up. The other three already had albums out, so he was probably anxious to get his own musical statement standing on his own out. You know, he was depressed and going through a hard time at the time. This is also his idea for Let It Be in the Get Back sessions, where after all the grandiosity of Magical Mystery Tour, Sgt. Pepper and Revolver and so forth, to just do Get Back to the Roots and a stripped down, just play some rock and roll. That was the plan for Get Back, which was mainly Paul's idea. And that worked out somewhat, but didn't exactly work out, and a lot of infighting in the group during those sessions. And this is kind of that stripped back idea of Get Back album. So maybe he just, since it didn't work out with the Beatles the way he wanted it to, he figured he would do it on his own. I'm thinking maybe. And, you know, and after the Beatles and all the fame on a level that no one had ever experienced, maybe he just wanted to sort of step back and, you know, do a low-key album. And so can't blame him for that. So yeah, Hottest Son, Junk. Junk's Where We Are. Gave that a 4. Album, side 1 of the album ends with Man We Was Lonely. It's an actual song as opposed to a sort of a rough demo, half done deal. It's an upbeat sounding song despite the downbeat lyrics, and it's got nice vocals. Reminds me of something, a bunch of guys in a bar that are drunk that are sitting there singing along to some song, some old English folk ballad type song, or what's that scene in Jaws where they're on the boat and they're all singing Show Me the Way to Go Home. I like that song. I give it a 7. Side 2 opens with Ooh You, or Ooh You, or however you say that, which has got a cool guitar lick in it. It's a soulful, playful, funky sounding song. I like it. Like I said, I generally don't think that the solo Beatles stuff matches up to what the Beatles did, but in the case of Ooh You, I would argue that it would have fit in on Abbey Road, and I would rather have had, it could have been fun to see John singing along with that and yelping in the background and so forth, and Ringo drumming instead of Paul, and George doing his thing with his guitar, and I would rather have seen that on Abbey Road than, say, Maxwell Silverhammer or Oh Darling, because I like this song better than either of those, to be honest. And yeah, I give that a didn't write a thing. I'm going to say, oh, 7. There it is. I give that a 7. 7.5. Let's go, because I like that one. Second song is Mama Miss America, which is an instrumental, one of the longer songs on the album. It's sounds kind of like a surf music in some ways, that it could be soundtrack music to one of those old surf movies. It's got a nice tempo change in the middle of it. It's a cool little instrumental, but I think it's like 4 minutes or 4 seconds, so it's probably about a minute or so too long, but it's still good. I give it a 7.5. Third song, side 2, is Teddy Boy, which was another thing that he wrote in India back in '68 and was considered for the Let It Be album and for, I think, maybe the White Album, but definitely the Let It Be album. Fortunately, the Beatles said hell no, uh, and because this is melodic at times in the song, but it's just a lightweight throwaway and dumb lyrics, and it's just a silly thing like the John's "What's the News, Mary Jane" song. Just I'm glad that the Beatles didn't officially record and release either one of those. And it's not any good. I give it a 3. I don't really like Teddy Boy. Sing Along Junk is number 4. That's just sort of a reprise of the Junk song. Nice little bridge section on the album. Kind of a, like I said, surf music on one of them. But here I wrote soundtrack to a moody, introspective, foreign drama with subtitles and filmed in black and white. So I mean, for something like that, as a standalone song on its own, I give it a 4. It's nothing great, but it's a nice little bridge piece. Number 5 is the most polished song on the album. Maybe I'm Amazed, which everyone knows. I think it sticks out like a sore thumb because the rest of this album is so, you know, lo-fi, do it yourself, just sort of throw something together and have fun. And this is a really polished studio production piece, which is not a good or bad thing in and of itself, but it definitely sticks out from the rest of the album. Um, Now, this is a song he wrote for Linda, of course, and certainly it would be nice if your spouse said, "Hey, I wrote a song for you," and sat down at the piano, and this is what they started singing to you. I think anyone would appreciate that. Uh, couldn't help but be touched. I never liked this song, and I know that a lot of people say it's his best solo song, and a lot of people love it, and that's great. I'm not going to say it's a bad song because it's not. It does have moments that I like. I like the guitar, the do 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 type guitar about halfway through the song. I like the outro, the exit, the fade out of the song where the he's pounding the piano and the guitar playing and so forth. But overall, I know it's a good song. It just never did it for me. I always thought of it as he's going to the same well where he got Hey Jude and Let It Be and maybe to a lesser degree Long and Winding Road, and trying to pull a song of that caliber out. And while it's a good song, it's not of that level of goodness. And it just, I don't know, it's just always a little dull or something. It's, I'm not going to say it's a bad song, but it never did it for me. I give it a I give it a 6. I mean, just if I was to grade it on its artistic merits, I guess it deserves an 8 or something. But for me, it'd be like a 5.5 or a 6. I just never cared for it. And I know everyone loves it, and I know I'm gonna catch hell for saying it's not that great, but it's good. I just don't really like it that much. And the album ends with Crean Acrory or Crean Acror, or I never knew how to say that, which is a weird sort of rock and roll avant-garde percussion piece. A strange way to end an album, but it's weird and kind of cool. I think I give it a 7. I kind of like that. I don't know that I would go out of my way to play it on its own, but like I said, with this album, it's always been one that I think is best just to listen to the whole thing from start to finish, as opposed to just pulling out specific songs. So there you go. If you would have asked me about this back in when I was a kid to give this a rating, I probably would have given it like a 5.5 or a 6 overall for the album. I give it a 7.5 now. It's grown on me a lot. He did a lot better solo, but I like this a lot more than I did. So I think I covered everything there, and we'll be back with Ram.